They said Mr. Kwan did not eat. He consumed.
He did not speak.
He issued decrees that echoed in the silence that followed. In the hushed, velvet-lined corridors of the city's underworld, his name, Quan Jinwoo, was a myth whispered with a mixture of terror and reverence. He was a ghost who owned half the skyline, a man whose quietest sigh could collapse a business empire or end a bloodline. When he chose to dine at L'Etoile Noire, the city's most pretentious temple of gastronomy, it was not an act of leisure but a royal visitation. The air itself grew thin, charged with the ozone of his power. The staff moved with a choreographed panic of courtiers attending a volatile king. And in the belly of this gilded beast, in the chaos of steam and clattering ceramic, was Lena. At 19, she was the lowest form of life in this ecosystem, a dishwasher. Her world was a 10 by 10 foot space of scalding water, grease, and the scraped clean remnants of other people's luxury. She was invisible, a pair of red, chapped hands and a perpetually damp apron, the hum of the industrial machine her only companion. She didn't see the patrons in their tailored suits and silk dresses. She saw the lipstick stains on their wine glasses and the streaks of sauce they left behind. But Lena held a secret. In the quiet moments, between the deafening roar of the spray hose, she watched. She watched Chef Dubois, a man whose talent was eclipsed only by his cruelty, plate his delicate towers of food. She watched the line cooks, their faces tight with stress, sear, poach, and fry. She absorbed it all, not with ambition, but with a deep, instinctual understanding that felt more like memory than learning. She knew the smell of a perfect sear, the sound of a sauce reducing at the right temperature, the subtle shift in texture that meant a piece of fish was cooked to translucent perfection. It was a language she understood better than the dismissive French commands that flew over her head. Tonight, the language of the kitchen was fear. Mr. Kwan was here. The arrival of Quan Jinwoo sent a tremor through the restaurant that started at the valet stand and ended in Lena's dish pit. The usual controlled chaos of the kitchen sharpened into a blade of pure, high-pitched anxiety. Chef Dubois, normally a pompous tyrant, became a jittering nerve ending in a tall white hat. His voice, usually a booming baritone of insults, was a strained, venomous hiss. Faster. Cleaner. Do you want to lose the star? Do you want to lose your jobs? He spat, his eyes darting towards the swinging doors that led to the dining room, as if he could see Mr. Kwan's aura bleeding through the wood. Lena felt the tension in the vibrations of the floor. The plates came back faster, barely touched, as if the diners themselves were too nervous to eat. She worked with a steady, rhythmic grace, her hands plunging into the hot, soapy water, scrubbing, rinsing, and stacking with an efficiency that made her invisible. To be noticed in this world was to be a target. Invisibility was survival. She could hear the orders being called, a frantic symphony of French culinary terms. Then came the one that made the whole kitchen pause. A single order for table 7, Mr. Kwan's table. A 55-day dry-aged porterhouse, served blue. It was the restaurant's most expensive, most difficult cut, a piece of meat that required more intuition than technique. The steak chef, a young man named Philip with more bravado than skill, visibly paled. He had messed up the temperature on 2 steaks already that night. This was not a steak you could get wrong. Not for him. Chef Dubois stood over Philip's shoulder, a hawk waiting to dive. Perfect, Philip. Not rare. Not raw.
Blue.
A cool heart. Do you understand? Philip's hands trembled as he seasoned the magnificent cut of beef. He placed it on the grill, and the resulting sizzle was so loud it seemed to suck all other sound from the room. A minute passed. Then 2. Dubois was screaming about the garnish. And in that moment of distraction, a flare-up. A lick of flame kissed the steak for a second too long, charring the fat, sending a plume of acrid smoke into the air. Philip froze. His face went from pale to ashen. He had ruined it. He had ruined a $400 steak meant for the most dangerous man in the city. Without a word, he ripped off his apron, threw it onto the floor, and walked out the back door, disappearing into the night. The kitchen fell into a silence, so profound it was louder than the previous chaos. Every eye was on the ruined steak, a symbol of their collective failure. Chef Dubois's face was a mask of pure, Unadulterated fury, his knuckles white where he gripped the stainless steel counter. "Imbecile," he breathed, the word like a puff of poison. He kicked the abandoned apron. The order was still live. The ticket machine still held the slip for Table 7, a ticking bomb. The sous chef was a saucier, brilliant with liquids but clumsy with meat. The grill cook was a teenager who could handle burgers and not much else. They were paralyzed. Du Bois looked around, his eyes sweeping over his staff with contempt. "Does anyone know how to cook a steak?" His question was rhetorical, an accusation aimed at their incompetence. He was already planning his apology, the groveling he would have to do. The restaurant was finished. And then, a voice, quiet but clear, cut through the tension. "I do," every head turned. Lena stood by the entrance to her dish pit, her hands dripping soapy water onto the grimy floor tiles. She had wiped them on her apron, a gesture of nervous habit. She looked small, out of place, a ghost stepping out of the steam. Chef Du Bois stared at her as if she had grown a second head. A slow, mocking smile spread across his lips. "You? The dishwasher?" He let out a short, ugly laugh. "What are you going to do? Boil it?" The other cook snickered, the release of tension making them cruel. Lena's face burned with humiliation, but she held her ground. Her voice didn't waver. "My grandmother taught me. She cooked for 30 years. I know how to do it." She didn't say that she had practiced on cheap cuts of meat in her tiny apartment, saving for weeks to buy a single piece to try and replicate the smells and sounds from the kitchen. She didn't say that cooking was the only thing that made her feel whole. Du Bois was about to unleash a torrent of abuse, to banish her back to her pit, but then he looked at the ticket, at the clock, at the swinging doors. He was out of time, out of options. A strange, reckless light entered his eyes. He was already ruined, so what did one more disaster matter? At least he could blame it on the dishwasher. "Fine," he snarled, a word that dripped with failure. "The last steak. It's on you.
Cook it.
And when he sends it back, you'll be the one to go to his table and apologize before I throw you into the street." Lena felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as she walked to the grill station. It felt like walking through water. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The station was a shrine of steel and fire, alien territory. The cooks who had laughed at her moments before now stared, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity on their faces. They expected a catastrophe. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the smells of grease, sweat, and fear. Then she closed her eyes, just for a second, and the kitchen melted away. She wasn't at La Toile Noire anymore. She was in her grandmother's small, warm kitchen, the scent of thyme and garlic in the air, the sound of a cast-iron skillet heating on the stove. "The meat tells you what it needs, baby girl." Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "You just have to listen." She opened her eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound, almost sacred focus. She picked up the last porterhouse. It was cold and heavy in her hands, a perfect thing. She didn't use the restaurant's complicated spice blends. She reached for the basics: coarse salt, cracked black pepper. She pressed the seasonings into the flesh with firm, knowing fingers, a gesture that was both tender and confident. She placed the steak onto the hottest part of the grill. The sizzle was different this time, not an angry hiss, but a deep, satisfying song. She didn't use a timer. She used her senses. She watched the way the fat rendered, the way the muscle fibers tightened. She listened to the pitch of the sizzle. She could feel the heat radiating from the steel, could almost see it cooking the meat from the outside in. Then she did something that made the sous chef gasp. From the garnish station, she took a single, fresh sprig of rosemary. But she didn't place it on the steak. Instead, she found a small knob of unsalted butter and, in a tiny, searing hot pan, she made a quick brown butter, bruising the rosemary into it until its piney, resinous scent bloomed. It was a technique of poverty and love, something her grandmother did to make cheap ingredients taste rich. Just before plating, she brushed the steak with the faintest whisper of the infused butter. It wasn't on the menu. It was a secret signature, a memory. She plated it simply, letting the magnificent piece of meat stand on its own. She slid the plate onto the pass. Chef Du Bois stared at it, his face unreadable. He didn't say a word. He just nodded to the waiter, who whisked it away into the silent dining room. The kitchen held its breath. The 10 minutes that followed were the longest of Lena's life. The usual clatter and noise were gone, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Every cook, every server, every busboy was waiting for the inevitable explosion. They were waiting for the plate to be sent back, for Mr. Kwan's quiet fury to descend upon them all. Chef Dubois paced back and forth like a caged animal, his face pale and slick with sweat. He kept glancing at Lena, his expression a cocktail of rage and disbelief. He had already decided to fire her, but now he was simply waiting for the justification to be delivered on a silver platter. Lena returned to her station, her hands moving on autopilot as she loaded a rack of glasses. The steam felt comforting, a familiar veil to hide behind. But she couldn't hide from the silence. It pressed in on her, suffocating. In the dining room, the steak was placed before Kwon Jin-woo. His second-in-command, a sharp-eyed young man named Min-jun, watched his boss with hawk-like intensity. Min-jun saw everything as a potential threat, and an unsolicited deviation from the menu was a glaring red flag. Mr. Kwon picked up his knife and fork. The utensils were heavy, ornate silver, but he held them with an unexpected delicacy. He sliced into the steak. The knife went through with almost no resistance. It was a perfect blue, a deep, cool, purple-red heart with a barest of seared crusts. He lifted the small piece to his mouth. He chewed once.
Twice.
Then he stopped. His eyes, which were usually cold, distant points of black, seemed to lose their focus. He wasn't in Latoil, nor anymore. He was somewhere else entirely, a place 50 years in the past. The taste, the salt, the pepper, the beef, and underneath it all, the ghost of browned butter and rosemary, was a key unlocking a door in his memory he thought had been sealed forever. Min-jun leaned forward slightly. "Is there a problem, sir?" Mr. Kwon did not answer. He placed his fork and knife down carefully, precisely on the plate. He looked up, his gaze cutting through the opulent gloom of the restaurant, straight towards the kitchen doors. His voice was quiet, yet it carried across the room, silencing the few remaining whispers of conversation. "Who cooked this?" The waiter, trembling, stammered. "Chef Dubois, sir." Mr. Kwan's eyes narrowed. "No," he said, the word as final as a death sentence. "Bring me the one who cooked the steak."
Now.
The swinging doors burst open. The head waiter, his face as white as his tablecloths, rushed towards Chef Dubois. "He wants to see the cook, the one who actually cooked the steak." All eyes turned again to Lena. A wave of dizziness washed over her. This was it.
The end.
She was going to be yelled at, fired, and humiliated in front of everyone. Chef Dubois grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin like talons. "You heard him.
Go.
And don't you dare mention my name." His eyes were wild with fear. He was pushing her into the line of fire to save himself. She was dragged from the steam of her sanctuary, through the gleaming, orderly kitchen, and into the hushed, candlelit world of the dining room. The sudden silence was deafening. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and wine. She was acutely aware of her damp apron, the splash of indeterminate sauce on her cheek, the way her cheap, non-slip shoes squeaked on the polished marble floor. She felt like a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. They stopped at table 7. Mr. Kwon was sitting perfectly still, his hands resting on the table. He was older than she had imagined, his hair a distinguished silver at the temples, his face a landscape of deep lines that spoke of a life of ruthless control and profound sorrow. He wasn't looking at her with anger. He was looking at her with a piercing, unnerving intensity, as if he were trying to see into her very soul. Min-jun, standing behind him, glared at her with open hostility. "You cooked this?" Mr. Kwon asked. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of accusation. It was a simple, terrifying question. Lena could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. "How?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. "What did you do?" She swallowed hard, finding her voice. It came out as a whisper.
Salt. Pepper.
A hot grill, she hesitated. And a little rosemary butter. At the mention of rosemary, A flicker of something, pain, recognition, loss, crossed Mr. Kwan's face. It was there and gone in an instant, but Lena saw it. The butter, he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. Where did you learn to do that? Lena looked down at her feet. My grandmother. It was her way. She said it made the food remember it came from the earth. The silence that followed stretched for an eternity. Mr. Kwan slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. He saw not a dishwasher, but the ghost of a memory. He saw a small boy in a war-torn country, cold and hungry, being given a piece of tough, cheap meat by a kind-faced cook who worked for his family. A woman who had hummed a forgotten tune and made that meager meal taste like a feast with a secret ingredient, a sprig of rosemary bruised into sizzling butter. The woman who had disappeared one day, lost in the chaos of history, a loose thread in the tapestry of his life he had long since given up on finding. He looked at Lena, at her honest eyes and her work-worn hands, and he felt the chasm of 50 years collapse. You're fired. The words, sharp and venomous, came from Chef Dubois, who had followed Lena into the dining room, his courage returning now that Mr. Kwan didn't seem to be immediately violent. Insubordination. Deviating from the menu. Get out of my restaurant. He pointed a shaking finger towards the door, his face flushed with a mixture of relief and indignation. He needed a scapegoat, and the dishwasher was the perfect sacrifice. Minjun stepped forward, his expression cold and dismissive. She is a disruption. We should leave, sir. This establishment is clearly not up to your standards. He saw Lena as a complication, a variable in a world that his boss controlled with absolute precision. Her presence was an anomaly, and anomalies were dangerous. He placed a hand on his boss's shoulder, ready to escort him away from the scene. But Mr. Kwan didn't move. He raised a hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it had the force of a physical wall. Both Minjun and Dubois froze. Mr. Kwan's eyes were still locked on Lena. He ignored the fuming chef completely. What is your name? He asked her, his voice quiet but commanding. Lena, she whispered. Lena, he repeated, testing the sound of it. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finally falling upon Chef Dubois. The warmth that had briefly touched his expression vanished, replaced by an arctic chill. She is the only person in this building who knows what food is, he said, his voice dangerously low. You are merely an arrogant cook who knows how to arrange colors on a plate. You are the one who is fired, Dubois's jaw dropped. He sputtered, unable to form words. The power dynamic in the room had just been fractured and reformed in a single sentence. Mr. Kwan then looked back at Lena, who was standing in stunned silence. You will not be returning to the dish pit, he stated. It wasn't an offer, it was a fact. You will come and work for me. You will cook for me. Only for me. He stood up, the movement fluid and decisive. Minjun watched, his mind racing. This was unprecedented. His boss, a man who trusted no one, who kept the world at arm's length, was bringing a complete stranger, a dishwasher, into his inner sanctum. He didn't understand it, but he understood the finality in his boss's tone. The shift was absolute. Lena was no longer an invisible girl in a sweaty kitchen. She was now an object of fascination, a protected asset of the most powerful man in the city. Her single, honest act of cooking had done more than just please a customer. It had fundamentally altered her reality. Life in Kwon Jinwoo's penthouse was like living inside a cloud. The world outside, with its noise and its struggle, was a distant rumor, visible only through vast panes of glass that overlooked the sprawling city. The silence was the most jarring part. After years spent in the constant roar of the dish machine, the quiet of the marble-floored apartment felt vast and unnerving. Her kitchen was a masterpiece of stainless steel and black granite, equipped with tools she had only ever dreamed of. But for the first few days, she was too intimidated to touch anything. Mr. Kwan, or Jinwoo, as he insisted she call him in the privacy of his home, was a creature of habit. He left early, a silent shadow flanked by the ever-watchful Minjun, and returned late. Her only instruction was to have dinner ready for him at 9. He never specified what he wanted. Cook what you feel, he had told her. Cook what has a story, so she did. She started simple, making the foods of her own memory. a slow-cooked brisket that reminded her of Sunday afternoons, a rich, savory stew her grandmother used to make on cold nights. She used the rosemary butter sparingly, intuitively, as if it were a secret ingredient meant only for special occasions. Each night, Jin-woo would eat in silence, his expression thoughtful, sometimes distant. He was not the fearsome mafia boss here. He was a man weighed down by his own life. After dinner, they would sometimes sit in the living area, the city lights twinkling below them like a fallen constellation. And he would talk. He told her of his childhood, not in a torrent, but in small, carefully curated fragments. He spoke of a Korea that no longer existed, a country of rubble and resilience after the war. He spoke of a large, cold house where he was a lonely boy, his parents too busy rebuilding their fortune to notice him. And he spoke of the cook. Her name was Bae Sumin. She was the only warmth in that cold house. "She was your grandmother, Lena," he said one evening, his voice heavy with the weight of the confession. "I am certain of it. After my family consolidated power, there were enemies.
Threats.
One day there was an incident. A fire. In the confusion, she was gone. We were told she had perished. I was a boy. I could do nothing." He explained that her grandmother, pregnant and widowed, had managed to escape, using the chaos as cover to flee a dangerous situation. She had made her way to America with the help of a church organization, changing her name to build a new, safe life, cutting all ties to the past that had nearly killed her. Lena listened, her heart aching for the grandmother she had known and the young woman she had been. The stories her grandmother had told her of a hard life back home suddenly took on a new, terrifying dimension. The steak was not just a meal. It was a message sent across 50 years and an ocean, a taste of a shared history she never knew existed. It was the flavor of survival, of a connection that violence and time could not sever. One evening, Jin-woo received a call. His expression, usually so controlled, tightened into a mask of cold fury. Min-jun appeared at his side moments later, speaking in low, urgent Korean. There was a problem, a betrayal within his organization. A meeting was required, a show of force, the kind of meeting that had built his legend. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at Lena, who was standing by the kitchen island, a silent witness. For the first time, she saw the full weight of the violent world he commanded settle back onto his shoulders. He looked older, wearier. "I have to go out," he said, his voice flat. "It may be late." She simply nodded, but then she did something unexpected. She walked over to him, her steps sure and quiet on the marble floor. "Be safe, Jin-woo," she said softly. It was the first time she had used his given name with such easy intimacy. He looked down at her, a flicker of surprise in his dark eyes. In his world, people showed him fear and deference, not genuine concern. Her simple words were a shield against the coldness he was about to step into. He gave a curt nod and left. Lena spent the next few hours in the kitchen, not cooking a meal, but a single, perfect dish. A rice porridge or juk. It was the simplest of foods, something a mother would make for a sick child. Something her grandmother had made for her whenever she felt lost or afraid. She infused the broth with ginger and ginseng, letting it simmer for hours until it was a creamy, restorative essence. It was a dish of healing, a quiet prayer for his safe return. When Jin-woo finally came back in the early hours of the morning, he looked exhausted. The shoulders of his impeccable suit seemed to carry an invisible weight. There was a small, almost imperceptible cut on his cheekbone. He walked into the apartment and stopped, the comforting, clean scent of the porridge cutting through the metallic tang of the night's business. Lena was waiting, a single bowl steaming on the table. He sat down without a word, and she placed it before him. He picked up the spoon. With the first taste, the tension in his shoulders seemed to melt away. This was not food for a king or a gangster. This was food for a man. It was nourishment for the soul. He looked across the table at her, and the chasm between their two worlds, the quiet dishwasher and the feared crime lord, seemed to disappear entirely, bridged by a simple bowl of rice. A week later, Jin-woo made a reservation at L'Etoile Noire. "We're going to dinner," he announced. When he said we, Lena felt a jolt of anxiety. Returning to that place felt like facing a ghost. "You will not be going as a cook," he said, seeing the fear in her eyes. "You will be my guest that evening." He presented her with a box. Inside was a simple but exquisitely tailored dress of deep sapphire silk. It felt alien against her skin, used to the rough cotton of aprons and worn-out jeans. When she emerged, Jinwoo was waiting, dressed in a dark, perfectly cut suit. He looked at her, and for the first time, his gaze held something more than memory and respect. It held a quiet admiration. Min-jun drove them, his eyes in the rearview mirror betraying his continued confusion, though it was now tempered with a grudging respect for Lena. He had seen the profound effect she had on his boss, how she had managed to soothe the storm in him that had raged for 50 years. They walked into Le Toile Noir, and a hush fell over the dining room. The staff, now under a new head chef since Dubois's unceremonious dismissal, froze. They saw not the dishwasher they had once mocked, but a poised, beautiful woman on the arm of the most powerful man in the city. They were seated at table 7, the very same table where their lives had collided. The new chef came out to personally take their order, his hands trembling. Jinwoo waved him off. "Miss Lena will be ordering for us tonight," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. He then announced his second purpose for being there. He had bought the restaurant. The papers had been signed that afternoon. The staff stared, wide-eyed. He wasn't finished. "It is a gift," he continued, turning to Lena. "It is yours." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She looked at him, her eyes searching his for an explanation. "This place," he said, his voice low and meant only for her, "was built on arrogance and fear. You will rebuild it with honesty and heart. True power, Lena, is not in being served. It is in creating something that can nourish others." It was the ultimate reversal. The dishwasher now owned the temple of gastronomy. The girl who was invisible was now the center of its universe. Chef Dubois, who had reportedly been unable to find work anywhere else in the city, was a ghost. Lena was the new reality. She had not sought power or wealth, but in her quiet refusal to be anything but herself, she had inherited it all. The story of the dishwasher who charmed a king with a single steak became another city legend, whispered in the same tones as the tales of Mr. Kwan's ruthlessness. But Lena had no interest in legends. She closed Le Toile Noir for a month. When it reopened, it was different. The name was changed to Sumin's, in honor of the grandmother who had connected them. The pretentious decor was replaced with warm wood and soft lighting. The menu was simpler, filled with dishes that told stories, food that was honest and nourishing. Mrs. Park, the quiet prep cook who had always offered Lena a kind smile, was now her sous chef. The kitchen was no longer a place of fear, but one of collaboration and respect. Jinwoo never interfered, but he was a constant, steady presence in her life. Their relationship unfolded not in grand romantic gestures, but in quiet, shared moments. In the way he would watch her cook, his expression soft. In the way she would wait up for him, a simple meal ready no matter the hour. His world was still dangerous, his business still shrouded in shadow. But when he was with her, he was just Jinwoo, a man finding his way back from a long, cold exile of the soul. Their marriage was not a dramatic announcement to the world. It was a quiet decision made over a bowl of stew in their kitchen, the city lights a silent witness below. It was an acknowledgement of a bond that had been forged in a moment of crisis and tempered in shared memory and mutual respect.
It was a partnership.
He offered her safety and the freedom to pursue her passion. She offered him a sanctuary, a taste of the humanity he thought he had lost forever. One evening, months after they were married, Jinwoo came into the kitchen at Sumin's after a long service. Lena was tired but glowing, her face smudged with flour. He didn't say anything. He just came up behind her and gently took the dish towel from her hand. He turned her around to face him, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the smudge of flour. "My grandmother used to say that every meal is a chance at redemption," Lena said softly, looking up at him. Jinwoo's eyes, so often guarded and cold, were filled with a profound warmth. "She was right," he murmured, before leaning down to kiss her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but one of deep, abiding gratitude. A kiss that tasted of rosemary and memory, and the quiet promise of home.